Hello and welcome to Lois and Morgana Davidson Art. It's Morgana here, and today I'll be showing you how to paint this simple grey sky day wetland scene using watercolours. Now I'm starting really simply today with a plain sheet of watercolour paper taped onto my board and laid flat. This is Milford brand watercolour paper, size 1/4 imperial. The colours I'll be using are on screen at the moment, and all I'm doing first is giving a nice clean wash of water across the top 2/3 and adding a small amount down below in the lower third, leaving some dry patches. And now I've added a very light splash of alizarin crimson just into the sky here on the left side. You can see how light it is. That's just going to give a little bit of extra depth and tone to this sky, which is otherwise going to be incredibly simple. I'm just sweeping some diluted Payne's grey across the paper with my large flat brush. This is a 2-inch brush, and I'm using plenty of water as well, and you can see that this colour is softening really nicely over the alizarin crimson. It's just giving us a slight subtle glow in that sort of right hand area of the sky. And now to add a little bit of detail, whilst this paper is still really wet, you can see the paint I'm putting on is softening and diffusing up straight away, which is really nice. These are just going to be some background distant trees that are going to go really misty and soft as they continue to soften into the water that's already there. So while they get on and do that, I'm going to add a nice sweep of dry brush across this foreground. You can see it hasn't quite taken on some of the areas of paper that are not completely wet, which is a really nice way to do easy dry brush. And now I'm just zigzagging in a little bit of darker paint really loosely, and this is going to be the land area of this wetland scene. Now at this point I can add in some darker shapes because we're all very sort of pale and mid-tone here, so we do want some darks. And I'm still sticking with Payne's grey here, and I'm using my liner brush to get just some really long, loose sort of landscape style shapes into this foreground. And the fun thing about doing this is, as you can see, I'm putting these shapes in wet and wet, basically over these little wet areas that I've literally just painted in, and we're already getting those lovely sort of soft blooms of colour going upwards into the paint here, and that's just sort of creating our foreground for us really nice and simply. It's a really lovely technique, and of course you can do it with any colour here. I know the Payne's grey looks very blue, slightly innocuous for a marsh scene perhaps, blue grass and blue plants, but don't worry, we'll be adding in a few more colours later. And I must admit, I do really like the sort of soft sort of tonal values here that we're getting from this Payne's grey. Now, whilst I've been working on the foreground, you'll notice that along the horizon line, those dark shapes that I put in before have softened down quite dramatically and formed this really nice, loose, distant tree line here, sort of fading into the mist and into this lovely grey sky. So at this point you can actually return to this part of the painting and start putting in some darker, richer paint and a little bit of extra detail and just thickening up that tree line. And here you can see I'm using another colour. I've introduced a bit of Perulian green here, which is a real favourite paint of mine, and I love using it alongside similar sort of dark colours like Payne's grey. As you can see, it goes really well together. And so I'm just using the sort of flat area, the belly of my liner brush here, to just introduce some more loose shapes along this area of the painting. Just pulling that horizon line along, making it a little bit straighter and a little bit darker. You see, I'm just going to pull a bit of paint along this empty patch here, just to give a sense of a really loose, distant horizon. And now to create some more interesting sort of tree shapes, I'm using my mop brush, which is quite damp. It's only sort of half filled with paint, so to speak. And you can see I'm just dabbing it on the paper where it's still damp. and creating these sort of soft, interesting, almost stippled effect for this sort of loose sense of distant foliage. Now you can of course use a stippling brush or something like that to create the same effect, but if you don't have one of those or sort of a texture brush, then this is a really simple way to get around that and still create these shapes. And this is how it looks like now that it's all dry. And I must say I'm really pleased with how this first layer of paint has gone down. So now it's time to add a little bit more detail in. So again, using the same technique, but of course we're getting a different effect because we're painting wet onto dry rather than wet and wet. So I'm using my liner brush. Again, this is my sword liner, but you can do this with any sort of long liner brush. And just sort of tapping it gently against these areas to almost get a sense of a slight dry brush, but in a very specific shape. If you can sort of see what I mean, we're getting these sort of loose areas of land here, these sort of darker patches, which are going to be reed beds in this wetland scene. So as you can see here, I'm just going to pull a little bit of paint up to start with, just to get those reeds started off. And that's sort of more for my brain really to sort of look at and think, right, this is where we're going to have some detail here, before coming back in and just making sure that these areas that I've marked out here are dark enough to make sure we get the right sort of darks and light sort of tonal values into this painting. And again, I'm using the liner brush for nearly all of this, but if you don't have one, or if you're not really a fan of this technique, then a mid-sized flat brush would be really great for this kind of work as well. So now I'm going to paint some lovely long reeds and rushes into this foreground, and this is a relatively simple and I think really fun way of adding detail into scenes like this, particularly wetlands or marshland scenes, where of course you would naturally have these kind of plants popping up on the land and popping up from out of the water as well. And I'm trying to make sure I get some variation in the shapes that I'm creating, so not just all the same thickness of lines, not all facing the same way, although I am trying to get a general slight lean to the right, as you can see here. I want the sense that a gentle wind is perhaps blowing across these marsh flats and bending the reeds over just a little bit, nothing too terribly dramatic or stormy this time. And of course you can do this with any brush, whichever you feel comfortable with, and I'm using my sword liner brush again just because again it's the brush I feel most comfortable using. And I'm making sure to create sort of little clumps of smaller grasses around the base of this little patch of land here. I'm also introduced a little bit of yellow ochre into the paint now, and you can see it standing out quite nicely and brightly against those dark colours we had before. I do love yellow ochre, it's one of my all-time favourite yellows and I really don't think I use it enough, so you may very well see it quite a lot in my future paintings. But here you can see it's actually working really well with the Cerulean green to add that little extra pop of colour into this otherwise quite grey and quite dreary marsh scene. And now here just working on this little patch that is a little bit further back, so further into the midground from the reeds that we were doing just now, and of course whatever's further away from us, from the viewer of the painting, so to speak, we want to make sure that these are a little bit smaller, thinner and shorter to help create that sense of distance. And now this is a fun extra little detail you can throw in here on these reeds. You can either leave them classic and plain and beautiful, or you can use the fine tip of a brush to add some little pretty delicate sort of grass heads or seed heads here, which is just really fun and relatively simple as well. You just need to make sure you've got control of that fine sort of point of your brush. A little mini detail brush here, or even a little mini flat brush, would work really well as well. I'm using again my sword liner because I'm really comfortable using it, and it's got a really nice fine tip, and I'm also too lazy to switch brushes as well. So you can see I'm just sort of scattering these little grassy sort of seed heads along this bank of reeds, and I'm going to go ahead and do exactly the same process on the right hand side of the painting here, just to make sure we get a nice balanced composition. And you can see I've gone for pretty much exactly the same colours and the same shapes, and I'm painting my reeds bending roughly the same way as well, so bending slightly over and to the right, just again to give that sense of a nice little bit of breeze blowing through these grasses, maybe creating a lovely susurrus of sound. And it's really fun to create these little interesting sort of flicks and shapes among the grasses so they don't look too uniform, keep them nice and loose. And now I'm going to add a little bit of spatter into this painting, but I actually want to protect my sky, which has come out lovely and pale and sort of clean. So you can see here I'm actually using a soft masking technique, just placing some scrap paper, this is paper from my printer, over the area that I want to protect, spattering away with my brush and then removing the paper. As you can see, we've got this lovely clean pale sky still, and the spatters along the bottom part of the painting just where I wanted them. Now of course you could leave your painting like that and it would look very beautiful, but for me, those of you who know me know that I'm an absolute bird nerd, so it is time to add some birds into this painting. So I'm just going to add in a couple of really simple geese in flight across this lovely marshland scene, and I'm doing this using a fine detail brush. This is a mixed media fine detail brush from one of my local art shops. It's a size 3/0, so quite small, and all you want to do to get these shapes in is to draw basically a single sort of horizontal line with a slight curve in it. That's going to be the body of your bird, and then a couple of triangles pointing either upwards or downwards for the wings. And you can see here on this second bird that I've got the wings pointing upwards, 2 triangles, and the straight line. It sounds more complicated than it is. You just need a steady hand and a small brush. And again, I'm using Payne's Grey for this. You can use any dark coloured paint if you want your birds in silhouette. That's it. You can leave it like this, as simple as that. I'm just going to add a little final flourish, which is a touch of white gouache into the wings and just a little dot on the necks of the bird, just to give them a small amount of detail, just to bring them out a little bit. This is entirely optional, of course. Some people like to leave their birds completely dark and in silhouette against that lovely bright sky, but for me I decided to give you the option to just put that little bit of white detail in there as well. And here we are done. That is the finished painting, ladies and gentlemen. Lovely and clean, simple, a lovely classic wetland scene. One of my favourite things to paint of all time. Certainly in terms of landscapes. To me there's something magical about these sort of half land, half water scenes, especially with that lovely sort of soft, misty, pale grey sky. It just speaks to me of just peacefulness and just calm and lovely serenity. So thank you everybody so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video today. Any questions or comments, please pop them down below and I'll answer everything as best I can. But that's all from me for now, so I hope you all have a wonderful day wherever you are and a very happy painting.